this whole book of Job makes you think, okay, so this is teaching us to never ever judge. Never in any circumstance. Well, I hope y'all have been enjoying the Job series. I've definitely enjoyed it. This is part 4, and we're going to be looking at chapters 16 through 20. Unsaved men suffer loss little by little, lose it all at death. This they do not understand. All their labor is for nothing. They have temporary comforts through the pleasures of sin, by which they are tricked. Saved men will experience worse suffering on earth. We are called to deny these pleasures and to take up a cross like Christ did. We are called to struggle with the flesh by the Spirit. For the rest of our days, our comfort shifts from our unrighteous pleasures to God. Then we are set against the currents of the world, swimming upstream, while being shot at with arrows and reproached. However, God will establish our works, protect us, fully comfort, and bring us through the suffering to a glorious end. Suffering is inevitable. It's the reality of a dying world. The question is, which side of suffering will you be found on? One side is bearing God's wrath with a surety of death. The other is bearing a cross through faith with a promise of life. Who will open their ears and hear? Only God can open your eyes. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 says, "So that no one would be unsettled by these trials, for you know quite well that we are destined for them." James chapter 1 verse 12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Romans 8:28. "And we know that for those who love God all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Psalm chapter 30 verse 5, "For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning." James chapter 5 verse 11, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Okay guys, so right there in James, it points out that Job is an example of steadfast faith. So let's get back into it, and we're going to start in chapter 16. Now, Job in chapters 16 and 17, which I'm going to combine because they go together, Job basically gives a monologue. He's not talking to his friends here. And I want you to think about what he's saying. I want you to pay attention to how he words his suffering here, because there's another man in the Bible that had the same exact types of sufferings. So just keep that in mind. Think about it as I read it. So the very first part is going to address his friends. Then he's going to start his monologue. So I'll start in Job chapter 16. It says, "I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. If I were in your place, I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain. God hands me over to ruffians, and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. And he has grasped me by the neck, and shaken me to pieces. He has also set me up as his target. His arrows surround me. Without mercy he splits my kidneys open. He breaks through me with breach after breach. He runs at me like a warrior. My face is flushed from weeping, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. My friends are my scoffers. My eye weeps to God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. Surely mockers are with me, and my eye gazes upon their provocation. Who is there that will be my guarantor? For you have kept their heart from understanding. Therefore you will not exalt them, but he has made me a byword of the people, and I am one at whom men spit. The upright will be appalled at this, and the innocent will stir up himself against the godless. Nevertheless, the righteous will hold to his way, and he who has clean hands will grow stronger and stronger. But come again, all of you now, for I do not find a wise man among you. They make night into day, saying the light is near in the presence of darkness. So have you figured out who the man I'm talking about is? A lot of these things Job said about his suffering is very reminiscent of Christ's suffering. So we're going to look at Isaiah 53 and read about Christ, how he suffered, and compare the two. But before we do that, there's also another man that suffered just like this. Same exact type wording, and that man was David. So we're going to have Job first, which we just read. His faith is underdeveloped. Then we'll look at David. You can tell that his faith is matured. He's a mature man of God. Hey guys, so I don't necessarily think that calling one man immature and the other mature was the best way of assessing these two men. I still think the comparison's good. But the more I've thought about it, before David wrote this, he had just killed a man and slept with his wife. And that is obvious and blatant sin. The psalm we're about to read is after he carried these sins out, and also after the prophet Nathan confronted him. Job also has a confrontation with a man of God named Elihu later on, and then Job starts sounding a lot like David. So I guess a better way to look at this psalm is to look at it as a man who has already been corrected by God, as opposed to one who has not had the rebuke yet. Also, the reasons for the admonishment for both men were completely different. David had been one who obviously sinned, and then Job thought he had not sinned, and there was nothing obvious that he could point to and say, oh, okay, I have sinned. He felt like he had done nothing wrong. So two totally different situations. However, I still think these passages are relevant to each other because they use the same wording and they're both still suffering. However, I think we are to look at this as a man who is on the other side of rebuke as opposed to a man who has yet to have the rebuke and be mended by God. Now we're going to compare the two. Where's the differences and where's the similarities? Then we're going to look at Isaiah 53, and that is our aspiration. That's talking about a totally righteous man who was God. Didn't necessarily need faith because he's the object of our faith, but we'll read his suffering and how he responded to his suffering, and then we'll compare it to David and Job. And like I said, we aspire to Christ and how he responded to his pain. All right. So let's read Psalm 38. This is David's suffering. He says, O Lord, rebuke me not in your wrath, and chasten me not in your burning anger. For your arrows have sunk deep into me, and your hand has pressed down upon me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities are gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they weigh too much for me. My wounds grow foul and fester because of my folly. All right, I want to stop here and point out that he says that arrows have sunk deep into him. That's some language that's also found in Job. However, Job seeks to defend his righteousness, and we see David seems to know why he's suffering. It's because of his sin. He says, because of my sin, because of my iniquity, because of my foolishness, all throughout this passage. We'll keep going, but I just wanted to point that out real quick. He says, I am bent over and greatly bowed down. I go mourning all day long. There's another similarity with Job. Job says he's weeping to God continually. For my loins are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am benumbed and badly crushed. I groan because of the agitation of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs, my strength fails me, and the light of my eyes, even that has gone from me. I want to stop right there real quick. And remember, sin hinders prayers, and sin will blind you temporarily if it's not confessed. And I feel like that's what he's saying here. He says, after I have sinned, you're not okay with that, so you're not going to support it. So he's realizing that he's in the wrong. He's cut off from God because of his sin. And because of that, he's technically blind. Now, as he confesses it and is forgiven by God, God is going to open his eyes back up. So he continues, my loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my kinsmen stand afar off. Those who seek my life lay snares for me, and those who seek to injure me have threatened destruction, and they devise treachery all day long. So in the next chapter, Job actually says some of these things. He says, my friends have considered me afflicted by God, and they don't want to look at me anymore. When I was wealthy and powerful, they would sit and listen, and they would say, okay, yeah, I'm going to listen to this guy because he's obviously got some clout, because I can see all this stuff he's got. So I'm going to listen to this guy, take his advice. Maybe I'll be like that one day. But once he lost all that, I don't want to be near this guy. He's done something wrong, obviously. I don't want to imitate him. So that's basically what's happening to David here also. Listen how he responds, though. Job does not respond this way. So there's a key difference here. Remember, this is a mature man of faith. And we're comparing it to Job. Like I said, I don't think I can say that, but I can say this. God is going to grow your faith your entire life. There's never going to be a time in our life where we say our faith has reached its maximum growth potential. The same with studying God's Word. The recesses of its ability to bring understanding is so vast and deep that the bottom will never be reached. However, the main message, the gospel, is very simple to understand. So as long as we get that right, that's good. That's a very good thing. However, there's more to be learned and to grow from. And what I'm trying to say is I'm not going to be right about everything. However, I'm going to try to be totally honest, and if I feel like something needs correcting, I'll correct it. But here's a lesson within a lesson. You should not leave the matter of your salvation to other people. Don't be lazy. You need to go and read the Word for yourself, because the power is in the Word of God. It's not in what I say. And your eternity should be extremely high on your priority list. Because our Savior, Jesus Christ, says, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? So pick up a Bible and read. You won't regret doing so. He says, but I, like a deaf man, do not hear. And he's talking about he doesn't hear the condemnation of his kinsmen. Then he says, and I am like a mute man who does not open his mouth. Yes, I am like a man who does not hear, and in whose mouth are no arguments. This right here is a big difference between David and Job. Remember, Job wanted to argue God. He wanted to defend himself, defend his righteousness. And then he accused God of being unrighteous for having such a tight grip on him when he felt like he was doing everything right. All right, so David realizes that God needs to be held in high esteem as holy. So he says, if I'm afflicted, God knows what he's doing, so I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to submit to the will of God. Okay, so in his mouth are no arguments. So after he says, I will not argue, then he gives a statement of faith, just like Job does. He says, For I hope in you, O Lord. You will answer, O Lord my God. May they not rejoice over me, who, when my foot slips, would magnify themselves against me. For I am ready to fall, and my sorrow is continually before me. For I confess my iniquity. So he's saying that he is ready to be humbled. He's ready to confess his sin. However, when this happens, people around him magnify themselves. They say, look at David, look at his suffering. I'm not suffering, so I must be doing righteously. And that is the wrong way to look at it. That's trusting in health and wealth and not in the Lord. And that's what Job's friends are doing. So I just want to point that out. That's two similarities in these situations. This is something people just tend to do. It's the way of the world. They look down on people of faith, especially when they're suffering. They look at it as an opportunity to put themselves on a pedestal. He continues, he says, I am full of anxiety because of my sin, but my enemies are vigorous and strong, and many are those who hate me wrongfully, and those who repay evil for good. Job and David were both good men. They took care of the widows, they took care of the orphans. They did things that pleased the Lord. They imitated God himself. However, when they fell, people around him that saw all the good they did basically said, now it's time to devour them. Let's get them while they're down. So their true nature, their true heart came out whenever the faithful fall. Now another person of faith would look at another man of faith and try his best to comfort him, lift him up, especially when they're crying out for mercy. A godly man will show another man mercy. And the wicked do what I just said. They completely obliterate them. They see their weakness as an opportunity. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, do not be far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord of my salvation. So when we look at Job's passage versus David's, you can see that it's almost like they could be, if I read this and didn't tell you who it was, you wouldn't really know who I was talking about because they're so similar. But the difference is David was more than willing to confess and lay out his sin before God and say, take it, Lord, please. However, Job had a hard time doing this for some reason. He needed to learn some things. Okay, he's still an infant in his faith. As parents, we can see that our kids will do things that they're not aware is wrong. They may have a little bit of an awareness, but you have to sit them down and teach them, and then you're going to have to punish them to make them take in the message better. So, in a way, that's what God is doing to Job. We are to chastise and afflict our children with suffering in order to teach them to do right. Train up a child in the way they should go, and they will not depart from it. All right, now we're going to look at Jesus in Isaiah 53. Okay, so I'm going to read through that, and keep in mind the two passages I just read to you, and make the comparisons here. This is a truly righteous man that went through suffering. He didn't even deserve it. Job and David did deserve it. All right, so just keep that in mind when I read this, and we're going to see how did Jesus respond to suffering. Before we do that, I want to point out a similarity between Job and Christ. Let me read Job chapter 2. They're talking about Job's friends when their journey was coming to an end and they saw Job from afar. It says they saw him from a distance. They could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. So this is similar to Christ, because whenever they saw Christ and him on the cross, it says that he was barely recognizable. So let me read Isaiah 52 verse 14. It says, "Just as many were astonished at you, So his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. They were both disfigured. Job, an unrighteous sinner, and then Jesus, the righteous man. And it says about Jesus that he was marred more than any other man has ever been. So this is Isaiah 53. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look at him, nor an appearance that we would take pleasure in him. He was despised and abandoned by men, a man of great pain and familiar with sickness. And like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we had no regard for him. However, it was our sickness that he himself bore, and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. So the reason that the Pharisees put Jesus on the cross was obviously because they were wicked, but their excuse was he was a blasphemer. So they saw him as wicked, so whenever he was afflicted, they were like, yes, the wrath of God, justice is being served. That's how they saw it. Okay? So it goes on to say, but he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. So right there it says the punishment for our well-being. So something bad was turned into something good by God. It says he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that was led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living for the wrongdoing of my people, to whom the blow was due? All right, so right here we see, how did Jesus respond to all this, to all the people cursing him and mocking him and beating him? Absolute silence. And he, of all people, should have defended his righteousness because he was righteous. And remember, as Christians, we want to be like Christ. It says, his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord desired to crush him, causing him grief. All right, I just want to point out, they use similar words there. It said that Jesus had done no violence, and then you look back at Job in chapter 17, he said that he was a man of no violence. Okay, but who's actually right here? It says, nor was there any deceit in his mouth, but the Lord desired to crush him, causing him grief. If he renders himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. Now, what did Jesus see? He saw the good that was going to come from it. He saw the people who would be saved, who would be called God's children, the ones that he could redeem. So he went through the suffering because he knew and saw the good that would come. It says, by his knowledge the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, for he will bear their wrongdoings. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the plunder with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was counted with the wrongdoers. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for the wrongdoers. Do you guys realize how big of a difference the comparison between Job and Christ is? Job wants to defend his righteousness, yet he's a sinner. Christ said he was going to be counted with the wrongdoers, even though he was 100% innocent. And this is definitely something we should do. Count ourselves as wrongdoers. Okay? Because we are. It's the truth. Christ wasn't. The reason he counted himself with the wrongdoers is so he could take the punishment from us. God put our sin on him so that he could bring us to God. It's an act of love. It's an act of pure love. He's lowering himself to lift us up. So in imitation of Christ, that's what we are to do. Bring ourselves down, count ourselves as wrongdoers, and lift others up. Bring them to God. Be their intercessor. And what I mean by be their intercessors, I don't mean be Christ. I'm saying be a Christian. Bring them to Christ. Now, I've got a little drawing back here on the board that I'm going to go to in a second, but it basically, this whole book of Job makes you think, okay, so this is teaching us to never ever judge. Never in any circumstance. But that is not what it's saying. I feel like you should judge. We're called to judge. Otherwise, how would we know the difference between right and wrong? The key is to do it with the right perspective. We are to count ourselves as wrongdoers. We are not to exalt ourselves to the throne of God like Satan does. And many people do this when they count themselves as righteous. And I really do believe Job is seeking wisdom and he realizes he doesn't quite have something right. Okay, so, but his friends are the total opposite. They think they have it all together. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, this is Paul talking to the Corinthian church. The church members were seeking to sue other church members because of wrongs they have committed against each other. And they were wanting to take to the courts outside the church, to the unbelievers, and have them settle the matter. And Paul did not like this at all, but this is what he had to say about it. He said, "Now therefore it is already an utter failure for you that you go to the law against one another. Why do you not rather accept wrong? Why do you not rather let yourselves be cheated? No, you yourselves do wrong and cheat, and you do these things to your brethren." Okay, in Luke chapter 6, verse 29 through 30, it says, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, "To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back." And then in Romans chapter 12, verse 19 through 20, it says, "Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head." Now, I used to think the coals of fire on his head thing meant that you would hurt their feelings if you would just be really nice to them, even though they were being really mean to you. But that's not necessarily what this means. There's a verse in Isaiah that Isaiah went up into heaven, and he was standing before the altar of God, and he was saying, I'm unclean. I'm unclean. I'm a man of unclean lips. So one of the angels took a coal from the altar, a hot coal, and touched it to his mouth and said, all right, now you're pure. Okay, so I feel like this is referring to if you show people love through suffering, when they heap insults at you and they see that you respond in a way that's not typical to the ordinary man, they'll be like, huh. And they'll actually see their wickedness through your love. And in a way, you're bringing them closer to God. It's almost like they're seeing their wickedness and saying, wow, I shouldn't have done that to you, because they see that you didn't respond in kind. You know, they're seeing their sin, and they're more likely to see it and forsake it. Showing love to people like that, in a way, will refine them. It'll make them see their sin. All right, so we learn all that by reading Isaiah 53 and then, reading the rest of the Bible, really. But we learn that from Jesus Christ and his example. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 says, when he was reviled, talking about Christ, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, like Job's friends did, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And then 1 Peter chapter 4 says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." And what that's saying is, whenever you give your life to Christ and you forsake sin, that is suffering because you're having to battle your flesh, and it's not a pleasant experience. So that right there is commendable. It goes on to say, "So as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God." And the will of God is that you accept Christ and be sanctified from that point on. "If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right." So when we do what is right, we're actually trusting God. God lays down what is right in the Bible, His Word. And you listen to it and you obey it, that shows that, okay, I'm trusting that what you're saying is 100% truth and I want to follow the truth. And that's seen through our sanctification, which is our actions. Matthew 16 says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me.'" When it says deny himself, he's saying give up sin. And this does not mean to make yourself miserably uncomfortable for no reason, just to make yourself miserable. Like, okay, I just need to make myself suffer. No, we don't need to look at it that way. We need to look at it as do righteously, enjoy the things God has given you. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with enjoying food, enjoying air conditioner, or anything like that. Some people want to take this to the extreme, and we don't have to do that. Christ didn't call us to do that. Something Christians don't typically understand about the flesh is that when the Bible says flesh, it's not talking about your skin and bone. It's not something that we see. The flesh is anti-God, and it's something that's within ourselves. God made everything good. He made everything good in the beginning. Our bodies are good. The things that we're surrounded with are good. A lot of people want to take this, they want to make the flesh mean everything material, but that is not true at all. Everything God has given us is good. It's not the material itself that's evil. It's what's behind the material things, which would be the flesh. Allow me to read Colossians chapter 2, verse 20 through 23 for you. It says, "Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh." Now, basically what that's saying is people take the flesh to mean their actual body, so they'll submit themselves to extra regulations that Christ never said anything about. They'll be extra rigorous on themselves unnecessarily, and I feel like that's where a lot of people tend to go towards that way, and that is not what I'm saying at all. Anytime I say the flesh, I'm talking about the desire within us that is impure. And like I said before, everything God made in the beginning was made for good, like our tongue. He made it to praise Him with, but we use it in an evil way, in a way God never intended. All right, so we're going to go to Job chapter 18. This is his friend Bildad. Right after Job said all that, this is what Bildad's response was. He says, "Why are we regarded as beasts, as stupid in your eyes? Indeed, the light of the wicked goes out, and the flame of his fire gives no light. His skin is devoured by disease, and they march him before the king of terrors, which is death. Brimstone is scattered on his habitation. Surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is the place of him who does not know God. He could almost be describing the scene at the cross here. And that's what I'm saying. These people are doing what the Pharisees did to Christ, but they're doing it to Job, also a righteous man through faith. Jumping to Job chapter 19 now. So after Bildad says this, Job responds in chapter 19. He says, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words? I shout for help, but there is no justice. He has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he has put darkness on my paths. He has stripped my honor from me and removed the crown from my head." I want to stop there and point out there's two other instances where there's this type of language of being walled in to where you have nowhere to go. And in both instances, it was for a good purpose. Now, the first one was Jonah. He went out to sea to run from God. So he gets on a ship with sailors, and they go out to sea, and then a storm comes. And the way this storm is worded in the story, it almost sounds like it's a barrier. Because the sailors, Jonah tells them, "Hey, if you throw me overboard, you guys will be saved, and the storm will cease." But these sailors were men who didn't want to do anything wrong. They were listening to their conscience. They didn't want to throw Jonah overboard. They didn't want to kill a man. So instead, they tried to row against the storm. And this is what it says. It says, "Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him." So you see, this bad situation turned into something good because those men turned to God after that. Then we're going to look at Hosea. Hosea is a book that can be summed up with the prodigal son. The prodigal son is basically a short version of this book, but I'm going to take a little snippet out of that book and show you where God does this to Israel. He walls Israel in for their good. In Hosea chapter 2, it says, meaning Israel, she said, "I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. Therefore," this is the Lord speaking, "therefore I will block her paths with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips." So right here, God uses suffering so that she will forsake her sin. Israel had built up many alliances with the nations around them, and they were doing trade with them, and they were thinking that these nations were the ones giving them their wealth and making them rich. But the Lord said, no, it was me who was doing that for you through those nations. And now that you've lifted them up as your providers, I will no longer provide for you. But it's to teach them. God knows that if they follow God, the giver of life, that they will have life. And if they turn from him, they'll be led into death. So God in his love knows that suffering will bring them back. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2, it speaks about Israel in their wilderness wanderings. And I want to read a quick excerpt from that. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So the purpose of that wilderness wandering was testing and to humble them. So there's purpose in that. So we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1 also. This is talking about Paul and his sufferings, and they're very closely related to what Job went through. He says, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the hardships we encountered in the province of Asia. We were under a burden far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we felt we were under the sentence of death, in order that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead." See, so Paul straight up knows what suffering is for him. He knows that it's so he will trust in God more, and he will not trust in himself. All right, so I want to kind of change ideas here for a second. We're going to think about showing mercy. This is something Job's friends aren't doing. So what is the correct way to judge? Because they're judging, and it's the wrong thing. So how are we to judge correctly? And short answer is basically we judge by the Spirit. We judge in truth. We judge knowing that we are wrongdoers as well. Okay, so let's go to the board real quick, and I'm going to show you a good picture of what I'm saying here. All right, so right here we have somebody who would be like one of Job's friends. They're blind because they don't see that they're on the boat. They think of themselves as being above the law, and they're not. This guy says, "I'm not like these other guys. I am righteous. I have made myself pure." All right, but what they're doing and not realizing it is they're putting themselves in God's place. Now, whenever you judge from that perspective, that is wrong. That is basically you condemning others. All right? Now we have the other perspective. This guy is a seeing man. He sees that he's on the boat just like these guys. Now his motive for judging and using the law to point out what's wrong is to get people to put on these life preservers. So he has a different motive altogether. These people both use the same law to condemn. However, if you do it from this perspective, it's not right and it's fleshly. If you do it from this perspective, led by the Spirit, remember, Christ opens the eyes of the blind. So those with the Holy Spirit see the truth. He sees the need for these life preservers, and he, from that perspective, will tell the others that they're sinners, just like him, okay? Now, I want you to look here. The seeing know they're below the law. The blind think they're above the law. All right? But the truth is everybody's under the law. All right? We're all on a sinking boat, and the ones who want to close their eyes and pretend like they're not, their condemnation is just. In James chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom." And what law is that? That's the law of faith. "For judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment." In Romans chapter 3, it says, "By the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law." So the law shows the glory of God. The law shows God's character. Look at yourself. You don't have this character. You break these. Now, it's meant to show us that we're not glorifying God. We don't meet God's standard. We do not glorify God in the works of the flesh. okay, because they go against his law, okay, and it's meant to drive us to salvation. James 4 says, "Brothers, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. And if you judge the law, you are not a practitioner of the law, but a judge of it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy." See, I just want to point out here, we can do neither of those. We can't save anybody and we can't destroy anybody. So, to think that we can save ourselves, that's error. And to think that we can just cast down judgment on people, that's error as well. However, as a saved person, we can use the law. We can say, hey, look at these. We just point people to it. We consider ourselves with them in the same boat. And we say, look, we have not met these standards. See, we still judge, but with the right perspective. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 says, "Surely there is no righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word that is spoken, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others." Now this right here should pop our thought bubble when we think we're above the law. Okay, that should bring us back down to earth. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 says, "For though we live in the flesh, we do not wage war against the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not the weapons of the world. Instead, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We tear down arguments and every presumption set up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience as soon as your obedience is complete." You are looking at outward appearances. If anyone is confident that he belongs to Christ, he should remind himself that we belong to Christ just as much as he does. "For even if I boast somewhat excessively about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up, rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed." So what is Paul tearing down when he judges? He's not tearing people down. He's tearing down their ideas. He's trying to show them their error. He's not doing it in a spirit of condemnation. He's doing it in a spirit of salvation. Bring them to Christ. Make them realize their error so they can be helped. This can also happen when you're correcting somebody. It's a temptation. Okay, so saved people can also do this. So when Paul says take every thought captive, he's talking about you yourself. Don't put yourself above God. If you start thinking you're more righteous than you are, you need to take that thought captive. Bring it back down. Say, no, I'm just like these other people. But however, we are called to show people that, look, you're thinking way too highly of yourself. All right, Paul also brings in this theme of building up and tearing down. He's saying, my purpose always is to build you up, even though it may seem like I'm tearing you down. All right, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, "To everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak." So what it's saying here, there's a time to do these seemingly bad things for a good purpose, and God is doing this with Job. God is doing this with us. And we are to also imitate that. God's end goal is to save people. That should be ours. But there's two different methods. The guy you're talking to, where is his mind? Does he think more highly of himself than he should? If he does, you need to tear down. Now, if they are crying out for mercy like Job, you are to build up. All right, now we've come to chapter 20, last chapter. Now this is Zophar with his second attempt to speak with Job, and he says, I listened to the reproof which insults me. Do you know this from of old, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless is momentary? Though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue, though he desires it, and will not let it go, but holds it in his mouth, yet his food in his stomach is changed to the venom of cobras within him. The viper's tongue slays him. For he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. The heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The increase of his house will depart. His possessions will flow away in the day of his anger. This is the wicked man's portion from God. Job's friends, they just keep on and on and on with the same stuff. Alright, so I'm going to read Ezekiel chapter 22, and this is talking about the priests in that day and how they were evil. And it sounds extremely similar to Job's friends, so I'm just going to read that and we'll end there. It says in Ezekiel chapter 22, Her priests have done violence to my law and profaned my holy things, and they have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. Her princes within her are like wolves, tearing the prey by shedding blood and destroying lives in order to get dishonest gain. Her prophets have smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, Thus says the Lord God, when the Lord has not spoken. The people of the land have practiced oppression and committed robbery, and they have wronged the poor and needy, and have oppressed the sojourner without justice. Alright, so remember, Job was a faithful man. He was righteous before God's sight. God said he was upright. And his friends are assuming the opposite. And they're declaring it like it's true. They're given over to lies. So we need to take great care what we say to people and how we say it. And what is our motive behind what we're saying. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video. We're going to try to get another video out within the next week. It's going to be chapters 21 through 25. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.